We want to thank everybody for joining today's call. We are very pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Kennen MacKay. Kennen is co-head of biotech research with RBC Capital Markets, and Kennen is actually really focused on drug development and commercialization. Kennen is a member of the board of advisors to UCLA's College of Physical Science. He is also a frequent guest on various media outlets such as CNBC, addressing COVID-19 matters. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kennen. Kennen, thank you so much for joining our call today.
Oh, thank you so much. Everyone should be seeing the front of a report actually that I just updated and put out this morning. And today what I'm really going to focus on is some of the work that we've been doing around COVID-19, our projections tracking the virus, as well as some of the drugs that are in development and sort of where this really could go here in the US. And again, by way of background, I'm one of the senior biotechnology analysts at RBC. I've spent the vast majority of my career covering biotechnology, vetting new drugs in development, and really examining investments in biotech. That said, I do have a background in the sciences. I've done a PhD in biochemistry and a postdoc in molecular biology. And during this COVID-19 crisis, I've sort of rededicated a lot of my time to tracking the virus. But before we do jump in, I just want to give a shout out to my team, Ting Liu and Bikram Singh, who really do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Bikram is a physician by training, a medical doctor. Ting is a scientist as well by training with a PhD in molecular biology. So just jumping into this, we're going to dive into a little bit of sort of math and our projections first, and then we'll get into some of sort of the higher trends. So this is just a sort of looking at a snapshot of where we are in the US sort of over the next sort of 7 days. And then again, looking at that on a much sort of broader scale in terms of where the US is in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is just looking at the total number of cases on the y-axis. This is cumulative cases. And then again, making projections as to sort of where that could go. Right now in the US, we've been seeing anywhere from sort of the high teens to sort of the low to mid 20s of thousands of new cases per day. And it's been slowing. If you look at this curve, this again is the cumulative number of cases over time versus time rather. And it's plotted on a log scale so that we can see sort of these slowing functions a little bit easier. And what you see is the doubling time of the virus really is beginning to increase in the US. Now, that's obviously something that we've seen a lot of. We've seen that in the news quite a bit. But the doubling time now is over 50 days. And a linear line on a log scale axis like this would be indicative of exponential growth. So that's not what we're seeing anymore. We're seeing this line really start to sort of taper off over time. Hopefully, what we're hoping for here is reaching an asymptote. But what we're seeing now, again, is that doubling time really beginning to increase. So great signs here. But again, the virus is still spreading quite rapidly through the country. The number of cases that are out there doubling still, even still after these quarantines, almost every 50 days, about 48 days as of now. Just looking at our predictions, sort of where are we now? In our base case, which is assuming sort of linear declines in day-over-day new cases, and we'll get to that in a moment, we're predicting nearly 2 million, 1.9 million cumulative cases after the first week of June, just 80,000 higher in our worst case scenario. So something that we are thinking is going to continue to grow, continue to spread. And again, we'll dig into this a little bit more. Now here is looking at the number of new viral cases on a daily basis. So this is going back from the beginning of March and then projecting the number of daily cases, or tracking the number of daily cases in this dark blue here, and then projecting it out. And we just give a sort of a week snapshot into the future in these light blue bars. And again, this is looking at our best case scenario, our base case scenario, and then sort of a worst case scenario where the virus continues to grow on a daily basis. And if you think about, what the number of daily new cases represents, that's essentially the change in the speed at which the virus is spreading through the country. If you think about the cumulative case curve, what we were just looking at in the former chart, the slope of that curve and the change in the slope of that curve is really sort of represented by the daily new cases. And so I think this is probably the most important metric to follow, because it's really indicative of the acceleration. And again, this is going to get into a little bit of sort of physics in terms of how we get this, and then we'll look at some of the higher trends and some physics. But what you're seeing, just sort of looking at this, is back in March in the US, and again, dark blue is sort of real historical data here. What we saw was really quite exponential growth in March, and then really sort of a plateauing trend throughout the majority of April, from early April on, and then maybe some slight declines here in May. But we'll look at this now on sort of a cumulative basis, and the red dots here, these are actual sort of reported cases, and the white squares, circles, and triangles, those are all of our projections. So you can sort of see how our projections historically fit the real data. What you'll notice here is, again, the cumulative number of cases just here in the US, the real sort of rate of acceleration has come down. If you just sort of look at the trends for the last several weeks in May here, you'll notice that it's almost growing at sort of a linear rate. And what that means, and again, cumulative cases, not necessarily active cases, but what that means is we're adding a similar number of new cases every day. And that's, again, despite some of the quarantine and social distancing efforts that have gone on. And that really has had me a little bit concerned. So then, again, I talked about some of the math that we'll dive into. This will be very short, so just bear with me here. But this is really how we do the projections, and this is how we think about the various phases of the spread of the virus through the US. And this first curve here is indicative of the cumulative number of cases that are out there. So I'll just go back to the prior slide. That's meant to be sort of representative of what this curve could look like, the cumulative number of new daily cases. Oops. And where we are now is sort of right in this sort of middle phase in terms of what this curve ultimately should look like, what these infection curves should look like. So to begin with, you have this sort of initial exponential phase, and then that actually sees rapid growth with the axis where it is. You can't really see how quickly that is growing, but this is exponential growth. And then with the onset of social distancing, this exponential phase sort of shifts to a sub-exponential phase of growth. It's not sort of doubling at the same period every period, or the same rate every period, but it's still accelerating every day. And back here in actuality in the US, the doubling time in the exponential phase was about 1.5 days. We were having twice as many cases every 1.5 days. And then after social distancing efforts were put in, that really slowed the spread of the virus. And we sort of entered this sub-exponential phase. And when the slope of this phase sort of crosses itself and goes to zero, that's when daily new cases is sort of the same every single day. That's when you're beginning to plateau and you're not accelerating, but you're still seeing the virus spread at a steady rate throughout the country. Again, that's kind of where the US is now. Maybe we're a little bit past this because we are seeing cases maybe decelerate a little bit, but we haven't necessarily entered this recovery phase like a lot of other countries have. And you'll see this in the data that I present in just a moment. But if you look at sort of what this curve looks like, if you project this curve of cumulative new cases, and then you take the derivative of that, that is representative of the daily new cases. That's what I was sort of talking about, is the number of new cases every day, sort of representing acceleration. And again, this is going back to sort of college calculus here, but what that represents, what the first derivative represents, is the change in the slope of this curve. And so you can sort of think about like how this slope is changing over time. And then again, that's what that first derivative looks like. And again, that's what sort of the daily case data is representative of. And what we can do is, using these mathematical functions, we can really predict not only the transitions between the phases, but also what sort of the total infection levels are going to be, and even as a result of that, potentially get a look at the timelines associated with that, and even mortality. But that's as deep as I'm going to go into the math, and now we'll look at some actual data and sort of where the US stands versus some of the other countries that are out there. And what I really want to emphasize here is how really markedly different the COVID-19 infection in the US has looked versus other countries. Because we'll dive into a few of the state-by-state analyses. And so again, what this is looking at is a combination of the tri-state area, and the stacked bar graphs are the tri-state area daily new cases versus the entirety of the rest of the United States, the other 47 states, excluding New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And what you can see from those stacked bar graphs is really sort of a slight declining trend at the national level, but a really quite strong recovery in the tri-state area in New York City, which really was some of the hardest hit in the country. And you know what that implies, and not only in the daily new case data, which you see here, but also in hospitalizations for COVID-19. Hospitalizations, which is really sort of a leading indicator for both cases as well as mortality, really is declining here, down around 75% or so from peaks in the tri-state area. That said, in the rest of the US, the other 47 states, hospitalizations still very high. And we'll look at this sort of under a microscope in a moment, but the number of daily new cases outside of that tri-state New York City area actually is continuing to increase. And so that's what we're jumping into here. So this is looking at the US, the 47 states outside of the tri-state area. And obviously you can see daily new cases, these are these light blue bars, over time going back to sort of late March. And it's very lumpy. And so what we do to sort of smooth that out and really try to get a better sense of what the actual underlying data looks like is just take a 5-day rolling average of this, which is this sort of dark yellow line here. And so you can see the sort of trend that we're looking at here. And it looks like it's sort of a slight incline in daily new cases, which means the virus is really accelerating throughout the rest of the US once you exclude again, the tri-state area. And so if we fit sort of a line to that, that's exactly what it is. It's again, sort of a slight linear increase in daily new cases, which again means acceleration. Daily new cases is that first derivative of total cases and indicative of acceleration. It means every day we're getting about 67 new cases than the day prior. The slope here is the number of additional new cases. So a slight acceleration outside of New York City. So not necessarily a great sign as the country is looking at reopening the economies. And again, diving into a few just ex-New York City states as examples of this. In North Carolina, for instance, we've seen really quite an increase in the number of new daily cases over the last several weeks. So again, this is looking from the end of March until today, Monday rather. And really both hospitalizations as well as new daily cases increasing over that period. California relatively similar. California was spared from sort of the initial acceleration in cases, the sort of epidemic phase of this, but it's seeing sort of a gradual increase in daily new cases, and the number of hospitalizations every day remains quite high. Again, looking at just a few more states, Texas had been one of the states that was previously seeing a slight increase in daily new cases. Again, not epidemic growth, not exponential growth, but still continued steady growth. And that's despite these quarantine efforts that have been going on, the social distancing efforts. But that trend has actually eased since sort of Memorial Day weekend. So, we'll keep watching that to see if that's sort of a real decline, a continued decline, or whether that's just noise in the data. Tennessee, again, had been one that had seen sort of a gradual increase, but now, again, looking kind of flat. Unfortunately, we don't have hospitalization data for Tennessee, so we unfortunately can't analyze that. But then just, again, looking at this sort of in totality here, we can see really what each of these stacked bar graphs are various states. Dark blue is New York, light blue here is New Jersey, Michigan is in gray, Massachusetts here in light blue, Florida in a sort of a flag blue. And really what you can see is that even as New York has had this really, really remarkable recovery, one of the hardest hit states in the country, that's been made up for by some of these other states. And we've seen growth in some of these other states. Massachusetts, for a while, was making up some of the declines in cases that we're seeing in New York City and New York State. So I think we are still seeing sort of a rolling spread of the virus through the country, even though, again, New York, which has been hardest hit, has seen really quite a dramatic recovery. So then one thing that brings up is, why are we seeing these really quite strong recoveries, as we've seen in New York, in the tri-state area, and really as a number of other countries, smaller countries, European countries as well as Asian countries, have seen really quite remarkable recoveries. And one potential reason for that, as we had talked about before, potentially, better social distancing, but I truly don't think that's it. One potential explanation is maybe these areas, some of these hardest hit areas, are reaching something called herd immunity. And that refers to the number of people who have been exposed to the virus, and this sort of enabling the virus to then really pull back and decrease on its own. And so in New York City, the state had funded a study to look at the number of people who've been exposed to the virus who now have immunity to the virus. And in New York City, it was around 20% overall. In the state, it was about 12%. But the hardest hit areas within New York City, even higher. In the Bronx, it was approaching 30%. But again, 20% across the city, Long Island down around 10%, but really, really remarkably high levels of exposure and subsequent immunity to the virus. And, I think there had been a lot of debate as to whether if you have had the virus, do you in fact have immunity? I'm absolutely in the camp that you do. I think really there are two outcomes. Either your body defeats the virus or the virus kills you. And, we don't have a cure at this point. So really those are the two outcomes. And really in any other case, any other infection, if your body does naturally defeat the virus, the infection, whatever it is, you have long-lasting immunity against it. So I do think that's the case here. And these data suggest that the levels of infection are far, far, far higher than anything that's implied by the diagnostic testing that's been done. That's all that case data that we had previously just talked about. And so just sort of extrapolating, what these antibody data could imply in terms of the number of infections that are out there. Again, 20% across New York, that suggests around 2.4 million people in New York City have been exposed to this virus. Statewide, we've only even ever had 1.7 diagnostic tests get run. Now, this is a very different test with 360,000 confirmed cases resulting from that. So that suggests, again, a couple things. One, that the level of infection is much, much, much higher than we had anticipated. The level of infectivity is much, much, much higher. This virus is much more contagious than we had actually thought. But it also suggests that the death rate is much lower than we'd actually thought. If you think about the number of deaths per infection, and you're using this number, the number that's implied by these antibody data, it's a much lower lower death rate, much less lethal. So similarly for California, there have been several antibody studies that have been done there. In LA County, they were seeing levels around 4%. Santa Clara around 1.5%. Over in Massachusetts and Boston, they were seeing levels around 10% of the population having been exposed and now having resistance to this virus. So really quite high levels of exposure. And again, to reach what I'd mentioned, herd immunity, the threshold had been thought to be at the lowest around 50%. And again, that's sort of based on some mathematical data around how many people each person who's infected winds up infecting. But what I think is happening here is with some of these behavioral changes that have occurred as a result of social distancing protocols, of seeing this in the news, that number is actually coming down quite a bit. I think the lower limit for herd immunity could be as low as sort of 30%. And maybe in these areas that have been the hardest hit, that have the sort of deepest levels of infection, maybe they are beginning to approach herd immunity. And that's really what's resulting, for instance, in this really dramatic recovery that we've seen in the US, I'm sorry, in New York City. In some of the other areas that are also entering these recovery phases, several provinces in Spain, we're talking about mid-teens levels of antibody formation of resistance to the virus. In London, 17% again of the population has been exposed, now has immunity. So I think that in and of itself could lead to declines in the spread of this virus ultimately, and really reduce concern around a potential second wave here. So the higher these antibody numbers are, these antibody data are, the better from a population perspective. So that's data that actually I find really positive. Speaking of positive, what we have seen is the mortality rate really sort of begin to go down. One of the big concerns was if the number of daily new cases, if the growth of this virus exceeded the capacity thresholds of our hospitals to deal with these patients and give them access to breathing machines, that this could, create big challenges and really increase the level of mortality here. That was, again, sort of the concern in early April. Mortality trails case identification by about 2 weeks, 10 days to 14 days. But what we've seen is that really sort of come back down and actually even decline below sort of the rolling averages now. So I think mortality will wind up, again, just on identified cases, well below 5%. And again, if you're looking at some of these antibody data for the number of cases that are actually out there, I think mortality could be well below 1%. Then, yeah, we won't dive into too many cross-country mortality comparisons here. But what I do want to talk a little bit about is testing. Obviously, if you don't test for coronavirus, you're not going to find coronavirus. So this is just looking at the number of tests that have been done in the US over time on a daily basis, the test positive rate, and then the total number of cases down here in light blue. And what you can see is this testing, this is cumulative. This is really beginning to ramp up here. And so looking at the number of new tests on a daily basis, you can see that sort of throughout May, the US has been running nearly 400,000 tests a day, again, for the last several weeks. So the testing here has really dramatically increased. And again, just going back to sort of mid to late March, under 20,000 tests that are getting done every day. So we're up 20-fold over the course of 2 months. Really phenomenal testing that's going on here. I do think we are now identifying essentially all of the new severe cases that are out there. I think previously we were missing a lot of cases as implicated by that antibody data. But now I do think the testing is sufficient to identify all the cases. And reassuringly, what we're seeing is the test positive rate really begin to come down again on a daily basis. Now, 6% of the tests going out are coming back positive. I think, again, that is indicative of testing a huge number of people and again, not finding a lot of coronavirus. When a third or so of the tests are coming back positive, you're probably missing a lot of the patients. So more, I would say, good news. Then just lastly, before we sort of move into Q&A, I just want to talk through some of the drugs that are in development. Obviously, we saw the recent emergency approval by the US government for Gilead's remdesivir. Good news, but again, not a magic bullet, by any means, not a cure for this drug. It does appear to improve symptoms, to reduce the length of hospital stays, but again, not a magic bullet, certainly helpful. I think some of the most impressive data, some of the data that I'm most optimistic about are going to be really sort of some of these antivirals, and then again, some of these sort of immune modulators. And some of the, like something called an antibody cocktail, these not yet, these haven't yet gone into clinical trials. They're not yet being used to treat patients, but they're still in preclinical development, one by a company called Regeneron, another by a company called Amgen, both of which I cover, and could be getting into patients this summer. And I think potentially those are going to have the highest probabilities of really impacting sort of the severity of this disease and the potential to treat patients throughout the course of their disease, not just very severe patients who are in the hospital on ventilators. That's really largely where these immune modulators are going to act. And they're also not going to be limited to the early phases of disease with no impact on the later stages. These antivirals might have their best efficacy only in the very early stages of the infection. But I think these antibody cocktails should have efficacy throughout really the course of the disease. So that really is sort of what I wanted to run through in terms of how we are thinking about COVID-19. Again, looking ahead, I am hopeful that we are reaching sort of some herd immunity threshold in some areas. For instance, New York City, I am optimistic that has been reached in some other countries. And thinking about sort of a second wave and reemergence of this virus, I don't think it's going to be these heaviest hit regions where we do see that. I think it'll be some of the areas that have, for the most part, really been spared from this initial first wave of infection. And subsequent to that, I would just add that as we talk about a second wave, I don't think there's any chance that this is going to look like the first wave, like what we saw back in March in terms of spread of the virus, for two reasons. The first, obviously, being that a large portion of the population has already had coronavirus, right? They've already been exposed. They now have immunity. And the second is the behavioral changes, people wearing masks when they go out, people washing their hands. And some of the people that aren't doing that, maybe having already been exposed. And again, really reducing what a second wave could look like. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. Hopefully we're done with the technical difficulties, and I will pass it back.
Hey, Kennen, would you mind sharing your screen one more time? I think some people lost audio on slides 7 and 8 talking about new cases in Europe and worldwide. Would you be able to review those real quick?
Yeah, goodness gracious. I'm so sorry about that.
No, don't worry about it. Thank you.
Okay, so slide 7, what I was trying to show here is really how dramatically different the trends in daily new cases look in the U.S. versus some other countries. And so on the y-axis here, what we have is new cases per day per capita. So again, controlling for the size of some of these countries, and the US obviously being much, much, much higher. If we were not to chart this by capita, you really wouldn't even be able to see the number of cases in some of these European countries because they would just be dwarfed by the number of cases in the US. But again, controlling per capita, what you can see is in a lot of these European countries, the epidemic phase of the spread of the virus prior to implementation of social distancing protocols looks very, very similar. This very steep exponential growth phase and then sort of sub-exponential growth phase, very similar to what we saw in the US. But what's different is after implementation of social distancing, and there is sort of a lag in terms of continued viral growth following implementation of social distancing, just in terms of the contagiousness and the course of this disease. But the recovery looks very dramatically different. What you're seeing is really quite rapid declines in daily new cases in these European countries. Even in Italy, which was among the hardest hit of the European countries, it's not as sort of sharp of a recovery here. This is this dark blue line that we're seeing here, but it's still really a marked and dramatic recovery. And now, 2 months after their peak, they're sitting down around 90%, 92% below where they had peaked. So we have the case declines from peak up here in this chart. And what you see in the US is, again, like I mentioned, a really, really dramatically different pattern. We're not necessarily on a plateau here. We are seeing sort of a slight decline in the number of daily new cases, but it doesn't represent at all what we've seen in some of these other countries. And again, I think part of that is just because of the size of the US. I think as I talked about surrounding like New York City, for instance, we are seeing recovery in certain parts of the country, but we're also seeing the virus begin to flare in other parts of the country. There's sort of a rolling infection throughout the country. So again, like as we think about what this is going to continue to look like in America, I don't think we're going to see these real sort of dramatic recovery phases like we saw in some European countries and some Asian countries. I think what we are going to continue to see is locally in some geographies, we will see those recoveries. But at the same time, I think other geographies may just beginning to start sort of an epidemic level of infection or rapid spread of infection. And at the sort of top line, the top line data, so to speak, at the countrywide level, we're not going to see sort of a truly rapid recovery. It'll be sort of, again, just continued slight decline. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. We're keeping the number of new cases down. This is below the threshold where our hospitals would ever be overloaded. We absolutely have the capacity to deal with this level of infection. And I think eventually, with this type of continued spread, the entirety of the country at some point will begin to reach sort of a herd immunity threshold. That's something that we model potentially occurring in the fall at some point, end of summer, maybe early fall. If we just extrapolate the trends that we saw in New York City in terms of where virus spread really started to slow in terms of the percent of the population that began to get infected. And then again, just comparing sort of what the US looks like versus some other global countries, this next slide where we lost sound, apologies for that. What we're comparing here is the number of new confirmed cases in the past week. So essentially this is the growth of the virus versus the number of total confirmed cases. So this is sort of the breadth of this spread of the virus throughout a population. And what you can see is when new confirmed cases really sort of falls off very quickly, like in Taiwan, for instance, Hong Kong, Australia, these are areas that have really controlled the virus early on in the infection and then again had really quite rapid recoveries. But really what stands out is what's happening in the US. Like we're apparently controlling the spread of the virus. The number of new cases isn't sort of rising in line with sort of the doubling time of cases. But the virus is still spreading. That's something that really hasn't been seen, again, in any of these other countries. And I'm just sort of presenting this to demonstrate that really something dramatically different in the US is happening surrounding how the virus is spreading throughout the population. And I think it partially is just due to the size of the country. As I've mentioned, some areas are seeing really quite marked, quite defined recoveries, like New York City. Other areas are really still seeing, growth of the virus. So I think that's what really is sort of differentiating this. And I think we had audio for the rest of these. Happy to run through any other slides as well, though, in Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it back.
Thanks. This is Jonas, and I just wanted to go over a slide that we have from Transamerica that shows various diseases since 1980. So we have battled the bubonic plague, SARS, dengue fever, avian flu, Ebola, a couple of measles outbreak, and MERS and cholera. And what everyone should think about is that this too will pass. And to have a good solid portfolio that is performing for you in good times and bad times. So if you are retired or close to retirement, this obviously has not been the time to change your portfolio. Going back to March when we touched on the low, most people were saying that things were going to get really dicey, and a lot of people got scared. But we have had a nice recovery. And that's because we have a stock market that's forward-looking, and that's where most people make the mistake. They think that the stock market looks to where we are, but it isn't. The stock market looks forward about 9 months to a year. So keep this in mind, that we have battled a lot of other diseases in the past, and yet the market has been going up, as you can see on this slide, which goes back to 1980, and it looks at the S&P 500. And with that, I'll let Kyle take over. I think we're having some problem with Kyle's audio, so I'll take care of this slide as well. And it kind of piggybacks on the previous slide. This is from Thornburg. And it goes back to the importance of having a portfolio that you don't change because of something that's happening in the market. Kyle, are you on?
Sorry. Yeah, I am on now. Apparently it was muted. Sorry about that. So yeah, the key here is the 15 years from 2005 to 2019, financial crisis during that time frame, and lots of turbulence. The annualized rate of return during those years, if you stayed fully invested, was a 9% rate of return. You missed one day, you missed one best day, your rate of return dropped almost 1% a year. You missed 5 best days, your rate of return annualized is 3% a year. So the key of this slide is really to stay invested. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but the key is not to panic. And this was really even more dramatic if you're an investor taking income. So please keep that in mind. Jonas and I are happy to talk to you anytime about this type of philosophy. And now I think we're going to turn it over to Q&A. And David, if you can take over and get some of the questions out to Kennen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you also, Kennen, for presenting today. We've had a few questions come in throughout. If you have any other questions, feel free to put those in now into the Q&A tool. If we run out of time and don't get an opportunity to answer your question, please reach out to Kyle and Jonas. You can find their contact information in this presentation and on the Patina Nation website, and they'd be happy to answer anything they can for you. So let's kick it off with a question from Michelle asking how Sweden is doing given their herd philosophy and if that is working or not.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. No, I think looking at the data from Sweden so far, we're not seeing we're not seeing any of the implications that they are yet achieving herd immunity. The antibody testing data that we've seen there is still sort of implying a sub 10% level of infection throughout even some of the more popular cities. So I think just thinking about that level for herd immunity very much does not seem as though they're approaching that yet, even if it is, again, with some of these behavioral changes far below that sort of 50% threshold that some of the published literature suggests might be the lower limit. Again, even if it is down around 30%, it still suggests we need at least 3 times as many cases there than they've seen so far. So not quite there yet, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from Bruce. How do you adjust the data for the fact that testing capacity is still building?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. So that's something that, to be honest, we don't adjust our data for. We look at it, and if you do integrate that into some of these analyses around the number of cases that are being identified through the testing that is there, it would imply that this plateau that we're seeing in daily new cases, this or slight decline rather in the number of daily new cases, actually is more representative of a maybe more dramatic, more defined recovery. Again, because that test positive rate is going way down. We're running 20 times, again, as many tests as we were in early March. So you would expect to identify more cases. Again, if you're not testing for coronavirus, you're not going to find it. But that's not something we do integrate into our data. There are a couple sort of mathematical functions to really dial that in. But I think that is that just risks getting lost in the trees.
So we've had a lot of questions come forth about timelines for vaccines and where that might come from. So do you have any insight or idea of kind of what that timeline looks like, or if there could potentially even be an emergency vaccine available in early fall?
Yeah, no, I'll first say that the timelines associated with development here are unlike anything I've ever seen or even heard about historically. Obviously, there's a massive social, governmental, and regulatory push to get really anything that can be disease modifying or the dream would be curative, but to get anything approved here, again, under even sort of emergency type conditions. So that is possible. I guess as I think about vaccine development, the real question in terms of really de-risking a vaccine isn't necessarily, are you generating an immune response? It's much more so, are you durably and safely generating an immune response? Biotechnology has gotten to the point such that it's really quite, I shouldn't say easy, but it's you can reliably force an immune response against really almost any foreign pathogen at this point. We found something called adjuvants. These are huge, these are enormous immune stimulants. And using these in conjunction with little particles of a virus or bacteria or any other pathogen, we can force these absolutely enormous immune responses. But the question is then, what happens when a person actually gets infected with the virus after having received the vaccine, or what happens if they're exposed to the virus? And what you don't want to happen is an absolutely massive immune response that sort of creates some of the pulmonary complications that these patients see. This disease is sort of already defined as sort of a biphasic disease. You have the sort of initial phase of viremia. This is exemplified by the virus really sort of spreading throughout your body and biological problems associated with that. But subsequent to that, your body mounts a massive immune response against it. And that that's what really causes the pneumonia and the lung infiltrate. That's really immune infiltrate and sort of your body's over response to the presence of the virus. And that can be actually what winds up killing a lot of these patients. That's what some of these anti-inflammatories and immune modulators that are in development are focused on, is actually toning down your body's response to the virus. So, I think the question is much more safety and what happens when these patients who have been vaccinated, what happens to them when they ultimately are exposed to the virus. And that just takes a little bit more time in development than, for instance, some treatments that you can administer to a patient who's infected and measure levels of decreased viral load, or measure levels of some of these immune cytokines and immune biomarkers declining. So I'm not optimistic about a vaccine being approved in the fall, but it certainly is possible, given these are, like I said, really unprecedented times.
Thank you so much, Kennen. We really appreciate you taking the time to present today and to answer the questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I know there were still a lot of questions that we wanted to get to. I urge anyone who had questions that wasn't able to get answered to please reach out to Kyle or Jonas. Their emails are up on the screen. You can also find them under the benefits page of Patina Nation and our 401k plan and wealth management. And you can find all the details on how to contact RBC. Thank you all for being on the call today. We appreciate your patience through slight technical difficulties, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Patina Nation. To watch more content like this, or for more information, please visit us online at www.patinanation.com.